we can have and Q&A after that. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So let's talk about proactive peer support. I like to start all of my talks out with a question just to kind of preface why is it that we're even talking about this? So why is proactively approaching peer support so important? I hope that by the end of this talk, it'll be more clear not only why it's important, but what proactive peer support actually looks like. So this talk, our agenda for today, it's going to be divided into 6 different parts. In part 1, we're going to look at what is peer support? What does peer support actually look like? Part 2, I'll talk about research, what the research has shown, the scientific literature has shown in terms of the impact that peer support has on first responders when it is utilized effectively. Part 3, we'll talk about barriers to effective peer support. Then we'll go into actually talking about what a proactive framework for peer support looks like. Then we'll jump into general guidelines, and then we'll finish with a few takeaways. So with that said, let's jump into part 1. What is peer support? Now, many of you here, if not all of you, might already know what peer support is, but I wanted to spend a few slides, just kind of breaking it down to make sure we're all on the same page. So let's break it down to the actual peer. So what is a peer? How do we define peer? So peer is defined as someone with whom one has shared similarities and or lived experience. Basically, someone we can relate to. Now, in the first responder world, there's a few different things that I want to touch on in terms of what a peer is. One of these important factors is that a peer should be viewed as an equal. Okay, this isn't, even if someone is a trained peer supporter helping a non-peer supporter, there's no difference in hierarchy. There's no difference in, okay, this person has more knowledge, more power, anything like that. Peer-to-peer interactions should be viewed as these 2 people or 3 people, they're all equals, okay? Another important factor about peer as it relates to peer support among first responders is that the peer is someone who knows the culture from the inside. Again, this is very, very important, particularly when we're thinking about first responder culture as a whole. First responders have a very unique job. It's not your normal 9 to 5 that you clock in and clock out of. It's very difficult for civilians and individuals outside of the first responder world to really know what the day-to-day of being a first responder is like. So this peer is not only an equal, but they know the culture from the inside, and they can directly relate to the unique and occupational stressors of the job. I actually heard someone else use this analogy, but I really liked it when he was talking about peer support. And he said, well, I may not have walked in your shoes, I may have shopped in that shoe store. So it's possible that the peer might have directly experienced what you're experiencing, or they can better understand what you're experiencing and empathize with it and link their own experiences because they are also a first responder. So now that we've defined peer, how do we define peer support? What is peer support? So peer support is a system of both giving and receiving help founded on key principles of respect, shared responsibility, and mutual agreement of what is helpful. Now, these few things are very important to highlight when we're talking about peer support. One of these things is that peer support is a short-term helping process. It is not intended to be the only line of intervention for a long-term helping process. And what I mean by that is, say someone reaches out to peer support who has, a pretty bad alcohol use disorder, or they're really struggling with PTSD. Peer support is not intended to be the only line of long-term intervention. Instead, it is meant to not only provide support, provide that peer with another peer who can listen to them, but it's also meant to be a referral and resource guide. So that person's there, they're listening to them, they're providing that support, and then they can help guide and walk side by side with that person to get them to the help that they actually need, to get them to someone who can actually fix the problem, right? So that short-term helping process coupled with the referral and resource guidance. Now, this last little box here is very, very important, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it too when we talk about barriers to effective peer support. But it's very important that we are all on the same page that peer support is not therapy. Peer support and peer supporters are not intended to be able to fix the problem itself. the idea is that they are there to empathize, provide support, and help guide that individual, that short-term helping process, to the individuals, to the resources that can then provide, for example, therapy. So peer support is not therapy in and of itself. All right, and lastly, when we're talking about peer support, what is a peer support program? We've identified what a peer is. We've identified what peer support is. So what is a peer support program? A peer support program is a structured, formalized, and intentionally formed team of peer support members fully supported by management. Now, there's two things I want to point out in that definition that I want to put your attention towards. The word intentionally, right? And so what that means is that there's some agencies that, basically, a group of people who want to be able to help kind of go rogue and form, a quasi peer support team, right? Okay, this is, we're going to run this and we're going to just be the guys that people go to, right? We want it to be intentionally formalized from the top down, supported by management, which means management knows about it. They set forth policies, they put funding towards it, and they keep it going, right? And so when we're thinking about a peer support program, as I just mentioned, when we're talking about a formalized program, the organization should have a set of formalized peer support policies, okay? This is actually written down, on a document, okay? Peer support policies can cover a wide variety of things, such as how to recruit peer support members, what the selection process of peer support members looks like, what the training of peer support members looks like, basically what you have to do to officially become a peer support member, what you have to do to stay a peer support member, checkups, checkup training type of thing, what confidentiality looks like, what limits to confidentiality are, what boundaries there are, right? We want to have a formalized set of policies. And typically, for an agency that particularly is starting to build a peer support program from the ground up, I like to first start with this, right? Let's actually outline what these policies are and what this looks like in your agency. It's also important that a peer support program consists of volunteer-based members. Okay, so we're not forcing anyone to be a peer support member. There are some programs which is totally fine, agencies that utilize nomination-based, right? They might have individuals nominate people that they think would be really good for the role. However, that individual ultimately should be able to choose whether or not they want to take on that role. So it should be volunteer-based. And lastly, as I've talked about already, a formal peer support program should include formally trained team members, okay? So they don't need, advanced degrees or a crazy advanced training, but it should be formally trained team members who are formally trained on how to provide effective peer support. All right. Now that we're all on the same page about what peer support is, let's jump into part 2, where we're going to talk about advantages of effective peer support among first responders. Now, all the slides that I'm talking about here are things taken directly from the actual scientific literature. These are scientific findings showing what advantages of effective peer support among first responders is. So we know through all the research that exists that effective peer support improves the mental health of first responders. It's been shown to mitigate symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and inadvertently, it's been shown to bolster symptoms of post-traumatic growth after critical incidents. It's also been shown to alleviate depression. Now, there's a few different mechanisms that have been shown to facilitate these processes. And one of them is that peer support has been shown to help process difficult emotions, okay? By being able to talk to a peer about something, either an incident that you experienced or some issue that you're having, that in and of itself facilitates a helping process where you're able to better process difficult emotions. Now, when we're talking about trauma, I'm a trauma psychologist. I can tell you firsthand that the number one thing that prevents the development of post-traumatic stress disorder is processing difficult emotions. So it cannot go overstated how important that factor is when we're talking about improving mental health and preventing any serious negative outcomes. Peer support has also been shown to decrease self-criticism, shame, loneliness, and inadvertently increased sense of support. Now, whether we're talking about first responders or military members or civilians, thousands of scientific research articles and studies have shown that support or increased support is positively associated with better health outcomes. So that means the more support someone feels like they have, the more protected they are against worsened mental health issues. So peer support, the name kind of gives it away, right? When utilized effectively, provides more support. Peer support has also been shown to build resiliency among first responders. Now, what does that mean? It has been shown to improve a first responder's ability to manage the impact of occupational stressors. So they're better able to manage these things. And the reason they're better able to manage these things is because peer support has been shown to help individuals build adaptive coping mechanisms. So they're better able to cope with these occupational stressors. Here's a few of the coping mechanisms that have been shown to be associated with peer support. Improving someone's self-efficacy. So when we say self-efficacy, we're basically talking about someone's belief in their own ability to do something. So for example, my belief in how well I'm able to perform my job as a psychologist, right? Or how well I think I'm able to manage adversity when it pops up. You know, how equipped am I? Do I trust myself to be able to do that? So peer support has been shown to increase someone's self-efficacy. It's also been shown to be directly related to meaning making. And so what that means is that whether we're talking about making meaning out of a difficult critical incident, or we're talking about making meaning about one's life and what they're struggling with, peer support has been shown to directly increase this. And so when we're thinking about meaning making, the reason why it's so important is that research already shows that individuals who feel some kind of sense of loss of purpose, like they don't have any meaning, like they have no purpose in life, that's directly related to a lot of really bad mental health outcomes and suicide as well. So the more someone's able to make meaning out of their surroundings and out of their life, generally speaking, the better their mental health is. Peer support also promotes problem solving, a very important coping mechanism, right? And we'll talk a lot more about this, particularly when we're talking about proactive peer support, but the ability to have self-efficacy and know that you have the ability to problem solve, particularly when you have a peer that you're able to bounce ideas off of and who works with you through these things to help you solve problems. Now, peer support has also been shown to build a person's ability to cognitive restructure. So what cognitive restructuring is, this is just a tiny little page out of cognitive behavioral therapy, but basically we all of us fall into traps of negative patterns of thinking, like all or nothing thinking. Like I make one mistake and I'm like, I can never do anything right? Or I do something and make my kid cry and I'm like, I'm a terrible mom. Right? Very black and white thinking, very grim, pessimistic thinking. We all fall into these traps, but it can become a serious issue when it becomes chronic and prevalent and it keeps happening over and over and over again, because it not only affects the way we feel, like I'm going to feel worse if I tell myself that I can't do anything right or that I'm a bad mom, but it's also going to impact how we perceive the world around us, our behavior, etc. So what individuals start to gain is their ability to identify when they're getting into those patterns of thinking and to actually kind of re-examine okay, is it true that I can't do anything right? And to actually restructure that thought, that belief, to be something that, one, is more in line with the facts, and two, doesn't cause me to feel so bad, okay? And when we improve our ability to cognitive restructure, we also also gain more positive thinking. Peer support has also been shown to encourage disclosure. So I mentioned before, first responder culture, right? It's a culture of, really kind of us versus them sometimes. Like, it's really hard for me to relate to people who don't do what I do. And therefore, first responders are more likely to talk to other first responders about problems or issues, right? It's more likely to be the first line of intervention, is reaching out to someone who I know I can trust, their safety and trust, someone who truly gets it, right? Even if they haven't walked in my shoes specifically, I know that they've shopped in the same shoe store. It's also been shown that first responders prefer informal interactions. Okay, and what I mean by that, if a peer support team gets deployed or to do a debriefing at a critical incident. That's more formalized. And those are good as well. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those. But when that's the only way they're utilized, it might not be the most proactive way to go about these things. So peer support, first responders are find that peer support is effective because it also allows for these informal interactions, right? Just kind of shooting the shit basically with someone as opposed to having to go through a full formalized debriefing. And lastly, this is very, very important. And this goes in line when we're talking about what a peer is, right? An equal. And then when we define what peer support is, remember, it is both giving and receiving help. And so in that light, the most effective type of peer support is when it is viewed as mutually beneficial to all parties involved, which means that not only is it beneficial, hopefully, to the person who is seeking peer support, but it is also beneficial in a helping process for the peer supporter themselves. These are two equals mutually benefiting from this interaction. Lastly, the research shows that peer support increases help-seeking behavior. So what I mean by this, remember, first responders are more likely to go to a peer at first when there's some kind of problem or an issue. And then because peer support is the short-term helping process, and not necessarily a long-term, therapy scenario, that individual, that peer supporter can then guide them to give them resources or guide them to the person who can help. And therefore that person seeking peer support is more likely to actually get help if they need it. Like, for example, again, if someone has PTSD or an alcohol use disorder, they're more likely to actually seek that help or utilize it if it's referred to them. There's a couple of reasons why. One of these very important reasons is that experiences and reactions are normalized through peer support. One of the detriments of first responder culture is this idea of I need to be strong at all times. I can never show that I'm struggling with anything because any indication of that means I am weak, I am crazy, XYZ, right? So when we have peers come together and talk to one another, what starts to happen is that people realize that they're actually not alone, that what they're experiencing is very common, and that a lot of their peers have also experienced that. So that normalizes the experiences. And anytime we normalize experiences and reactions, we decrease that stigma of there's something wrong with me, I'm the only one dealing with this, I'm crazy, I'm weak. That stigma is reduced. Lastly, peer support has been shown to motivate individuals for self-improvement. And what I mean by that is it comes from a very famous sociological concept of observational learning. So what observational learning is basically we're more likely to do things, we're more likely to pursue things based on people that we admire, right? So if someone that I trust and that, I have a good relationship with, and their life is, I want to kind of get to the point that their life looks, I'm more likely to be motivated for self-improvement. So in the peer support world, let's say we have a peer supporter and someone seeking peer support. This person's maybe having trouble misusing alcohol, and they're talking to someone who has been through the same thing, that, they're still in recovery and they're able to relate to them on these things, but through their recovery, their home life has improved, they're feeling better, etc. So this person seeking that peer support is more likely to actually improve themselves and get the help that they need based on the modeling of this person. Okay, these next couple of slides, I want to, whenever I'm talking about mental health in general, but I want to break it down both at the individual level. So we've talked about what research has shown is related, or the impact of peer support and the positive impacts that it has in so many different areas. So what does this look like at the individual level? What does me as a person, as a first responder, what does this look like for me at the individual level? Well, when peer support is utilized effectively at an agency, we see, generally speaking, at the individual level, someone's physical and mental health improves, right? We've seen that peer support decreases symptoms of post-traumatic stress, bolsters post-traumatic growth, decreases depression, and so on and so forth. So we have both a physically and mentally healthier self. We also, the research shows that peer support leads to an improved quality of life at home. So as an individual, not only am I physically and mentally healthier, I also have an improved quality of life at home. Now, I'm sure all of you here understand that there is not a complete mutually exclusive separation between when you're on shift and when you're at home. It's not a nice little switch that you're on shift and then the switch goes off. Okay, I'm home now, and now I'm mom, dad, brother, sister, whoever I am, right? A lot of times these two things get muddled and difficult to balance the common or the back and forth between the two. So when we have someone who is having a higher quality of life at home, what inadvertently happens is they also have higher work performance as well. These two things are directly related. The worse someone's quality of life is at home, the worse their work performance is, and vice versa. When we have a physically and mentally healthier self, we're happier at home, we have better work performance, we have a lower risk of injury or fatality, whether that be risk of physical injury or fatality, or risk of mental injury or fatality. Now, it's also important, we're not stopping just at the individual level. And this is something I really try and get across, particularly when I'm working with agencies and talking to leadership, is of course, yes, we want each individual person to generally speaking feel better, right? But we also cannot overlook the impact that individual improvements have on the overall organization, okay? So when we're looking at the impact of effective peer support at the organizational level, we see that when we have a physically and mentally healthier staff and personnel, we have higher morale. People's work performance is increased, their quality of life at home is increased. We have overall higher morale. When we have personnel with higher morale, we have less turnover. We have less retention issues. We also have less workers' comp and medical retirement because there's less physical or there's less injury, there's less early retirement costs, there's less costs towards filling or recruiting for positions, training for positions, all of these things. So overall, when we invest in wellness programming, we have overall less cost to the agency. And that is something that I really, really like to emphasize, is that even though in the short term right now, I might be putting money into this, it is going to have significant long-term benefits, including overall less cost to the agency. All right, so we've talked about what peer support is, and we've identified actual scientific research that has proven that peer support, when done effectively, has a lot of positive outcomes. So let's now dive into talking about barriers to effective peer support. Barrier number one, lack of a clear peer support program or lack of clear peer support personnel. I'm going to give you two examples that I come across pretty often when I'm working with agencies. Say I'm brought in to do some kind of wellness presentation, and then I ask, someone, do you have a peer support program? And the answer is, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think we do. If you don't know, neither does anyone else, right? So it is, that's one example of lack of a clear peer support program. It should be very clear to all personnel that there is a peer support program. Another example, same scenario. Do you guys have a peer support program? Oh yeah, we have some guys that everyone goes to, they're like, everyone loves them. Everyone goes to them. They feel comfortable talking to them. Okay, are they in a program? Well, no, they're just guys, we have people that people talk to, right? So that'd be an example of a lack of a clear support personnel, right? Individuals who it's not intentionally formed from the top down. There's no set policies. There's no formalized training of these peer support members. So major barrier, lack of a clear peer support program or personnel. Barrier number two, unclear protocol for contacting peer support. Something else I come across quite often. So say there is a formalized peer support program. Say people do know that there is a peer support program. However, they have no idea how to contact peer support. Okay. I was just at an agency the other week and doing leadership training. And, one of the people in there said, hey, I wanted to call peer support. How do we actually do that? And then a bunch of the other ones were like, yeah. How do we do that? Right. So if people don't know how, there is a peer support program, but people don't know how to actually utilize them or contact them, we can see the issue here, right? This is not only true for, people in positions of leadership that want to bring peer support in for their crews, but at the individual level, if I am someone who is struggling with something, particularly a first responder, it's already hard enough to reach out for help or identify that I have an issue, and then I don't even know how to contact peer support. That's going to be a major deterrent for me actually doing it, right? I'm not going to be like, hey, I'm asking for a friend. Do you know how to contact peer support, right? I'm just probably not going to do it. Barrier number 3, lack of proper training for peer supporters. So again, remember, a formalized peer support program should consist of formally trained peer support members. Now, you do not need an advanced degree. You do not need some crazy advanced training in things. It's more so just formalized training to not only give someone the skills so that they can effectively perform as a peer supporter, but I also like to highlight the reason formal training is so important is not so that the consumer, so to speak, is getting what they need out of it, but it's also to protect the peer supporters themselves. It protects the mental health of the peer supporter themselves because they know what their boundaries are. They know how to engage in a peer support interaction, and they know how to protect themselves from letting any of that, their role as a peer supporter, start to actually build up and snowball and cause them issues. So it actually, formalized training protects both sides. Barrier number 4, and this is huge, 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 role confusion. So I alluded to in the first part of this talk that peer support is not therapy and that we talk about it a little bit more. So in line with that, I see it so incredibly often that peer supporters are confused about their role. Okay, they're not really sure whether they're there to provide short-term helping process and get them the help that someone needs, or whether they're actually supposed to dive in and try and fix the problem, right? Peer supporters are not meant to know how to solve and resolve mental health issues, right? And so typically role confusion comes about in a couple of ways. One, they're actually received training that is really confusing. They receive training that kind of tells them, let's teach you how to do cognitive behavioral therapy and let's teach you how to do these things. I've seen that around, right? No, that's very confusing. Then all of a sudden I think I'm kind of like a counselor. Okay, am I supposed to actually counsel these people? Right? So that's one way. The other way is just that over time, a peer supporter just kind of, the boundaries become a little bit blurry. And the peer supporter, generally speaking, first responders, they're helpers, they're problem solvers, they like to help, they like to fix. And so over time, the peer supporter starts to kind of, okay, maybe I can, I know how to maybe jump in and fix this, or I want to so bad to fix this and help this person right now, here and now. And then they start to try and do that, right? So role confusion is a very, very huge risk factor. And here's why. It's a risk factor to the peer support members themselves. Here's what role confusion directly leads to. Burnout is a major one, right? When you're taking on all of that and when it's not part of your role, it leads to burnout, especially when you're not equipped. You don't have a mental health degree. You're not a licensed mental health professional when you're not equipped to do that. It also leads to, and this is a whole different training, moral injury. Okay. And what moral injury is basically we start to feel guilt. We're trying to help someone and then we're unable to do so because that's not our role. And then we start to feel guilty. We start to take on a lot of burden. I couldn't help this person. I should have been able to do something. I should have been able to fix them. Right. So that role confusion can have a lot of negative outcomes for the peer supporter themselves. Barrier number 5. Not all personnel feel comfortable with available peer supporters. This is very, very, very common, okay? There's a lot of personnel who are at an agency that has a formalized peer support program, and maybe they have 10 peer support members in that peer support program, but there's a lot of personnel who say, I don't feel comfortable talking to any of those people. And there could be a lot of reasons why, not necessarily that I don't like them, but it could be someone who's higher ranking not wanting to reach out to a peer supporter who's of lower ranking. It could be someone who's hoping to get a promotion and move up in the ranks doesn't want to reach out and talk about what they're struggling with to someone who's potentially in charge of making that decision of whether or not they get promoted. Could be because of a small agency in a rural area, right? So having a peer support program where not all personnel feel comfortable with available peer supporters, we can see why that can be a barrier, because then people are not likely to utilize it. Barrier number 6. peer support is only utilized by a small proportion of personnel. Now, that could be because peer support is deployed only based on incident-specific things, like critical incidents. And then the other individuals who utilize it are only utilizing it. Basically, the only people who are utilizing are individuals who are struggling or in need, but no one else in the department gets peer support of any kind. Last barrier that we're going to cover is that barrier of having to tackle the awkward first step of initiating. Okay. So when we have a peer support program that's not fully comprehensive and proactive, it puts the whole onus on the individual, when it's not being deployed incident specific, that, okay, I need to reach out and talk to someone about this. And that for some people can be very, very difficult. For most of us would be really difficult, right? Having to initiate that conversation, reach out to a peer supporter and say, hey, I'm really struggling with this, right? So that in and of itself, again, is often a big enough deterrent and deters a lot of people from actually utilizing peer support. All right, now we have identified the barriers to effective peer support. Now let's talk about what a proactive framework for peer support actually looks like. And we're gonna see that through this proactive framework, a lot of those barriers, all of those barriers are addressed. First, I want to just start with defining what proactive means and what reactive means, just in the general sense, okay? When we're talking about reactive management is basically reacting to problems as they arise, okay? Whereas proactive management is about anticipating problems and taking steps to try and prevent them from happening in the first place, or identifying the issue before it gets to be a serious problem and intervening so that we can stop that snowball from continuing to roll and get bigger, right? So I like this little cartoon here, very basic, but it highlights proactive versus reactive. So on the reactive side, this individual probably didn't look at the weather app, and they just left their house, got caught in a big storm, and now they're trying to figure out how to cover themselves from the storm. Whereas on the reactive side, this person might have looked at the weather app, and based on what they saw in the weather app, it wasn't a guarantee that there was going to be a storm, but they're like, okay, well, I want to take the precautions. So maybe they left with their rain coat and their rain boots, and they brought an umbrella just in case. And when they did get caught in the storm, they were able to utilize those tools, right? So proactive versus reactive. Okay, so I wanted to flash this all in your faces because then we're going to talk about this at the end of this part of the talk. But this is my conceptualization of how I approach mental wellness programming with agencies in general. Okay, so here's the thing: most agencies have reactive programming in place. Okay, and what reactive programming is, it's the third line of defense. It's crisis intervention. So, for example, if there is a really bad critical incident, a mass shooting, or the suicide of a crew member, or the line of duty death of someone, right? We deploy peer support teams, strike teams, chaplains, etc. All these people to come in, as a reaction to what just happened, right? Now, the reactive portion of a mental wellness program is necessary. We need it there. The problem is that a lot of agencies only have a reactive portion. They put most of their funding and resources to the reactive side, while completely leaving aside the proactive side of things. Now, personally, I think the proactive is just as important, if not more important, than the reactive side of things. And the proactive side of things has the first two lines of defense. The first line of defense is prevention, right? We're preventing things before they even occur. And the second line of defense is early intervention. So maybe some stuff is starting to happen, some issues are starting to form, but we can intervene before we actually get to that third line, right? Before the crisis actually happens. So I want everyone, just generally speaking, to keep this in their minds, and then we'll apply it again at the end. All right. So the next several slides, what I'm going to do is at the top here is going to be a topic, right, related to peer support. And then I'm going to side by side talk about what a reactive peer support program looks like related to that topic, and what a proactive approach looks like related to peer support and that topic. So when we're talking about identification of issues, having to identify that there is a problem and that peer support would probably be a good next step. In a reactive peer support program, a reactive program relies heavily on self-identification of issues. Okay. Yes, peer support teams are deployed after critical incidents, but aside from that, it really most of, if not all, the onus, the burden is on myself to identify when there's something wrong and then to reach out to peer support. And I don't know about you, but I know there's a lot of times where sometimes when I'm starting to kind of develop an issue or I'm struggling with something, it can like really go under the radar for quite some time, right? Sometimes I don't really start to notice I have an issue until it starts to really impact different areas of my life. And then at that point, the issue's gotten a lot worse, right? So in a proactive peer support program, this allows for a more comprehensive identification of issues that includes both self, because I do still have a personal responsibility to try and identify when I have an issue, but also peers, okay? So we're not talking about, we're all like, paparazzi looking at each other and trying to figure out like, oh, Brooke seems to be struggling. Did you hear Brooke was struggling, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about more from a cohesive standpoint of we have individuals that maybe are, because they're not in the storm themselves, are better able to take a step from the outside and notice, Brooke doesn't seem to be herself lately. She's not as bubbly. She's not hanging out with us as much outside of work. Something seems to be different, right? So this proactive approach is not only based on self-identification, it expands it. The net gets larger and we can catch more and intervene more easily. Now, when we're talking about when peer support is deployed, okay, when do we deploy? So not necessarily that I'm actively reaching out for peer support because there's an issue, but when peer support is deployed, in a reactive program, peer support is typically critical or is typically incident specific, right? So it's deployed only after critical incidents, after something bad has happened. Now, we still want that to happen, but we don't want that to be the only thing that peer support is deployed for. In a proactive peer support program, peer support is deployed for a variety of reasons. And don't worry, we're going to get into more specific of what that variety of reasons means, but it's not only incident specific. It is based on a variety of different things, whether it be good things, bad things, life transitions, etc. Initiating the conversation. So we identified one of the barriers to effective peer support is that can be really hard to ask for help. It can be really hard to take that first step, and it's really awkward to say, hey, I'm struggling with this. In a reactive peer support program, the individual needing the help is the person who has to start the conversation, right? That awkward first step. In a proactive peer support program, when we're talking about a proactive peer support program where we have, and the Peer Connect app embodies this very well. When we have an app such as that initiates in a peer support team, so Brooke is, coming up on 2 years of, since the death of her child, pings me to reach out to her. The peer supporter themselves also initiate the conversation. So it's not only the person in need who has to initiate the conversation, but again, that net gets much wider. And we're able to have both the person in need, if they need it, but also the peer support initiate those conversations and break the barrier between having to do that first step. When peer support is used. So we talked about one of the barriers being only a small proportion of personnel in an agency utilizing peer support. So in a reactive program, peer support is only utilized when there is an issue or a problem, okay? And let me tell you, we are all, as humans, we're behaviorists, which just basically means we really start to associate things with one another. And in a reactive peer support program, when peer support is only utilized when there is an issue or a problem, whether it be after a critical incident or someone has to initiate because they're having a problem, peer support starts to be associated with like peer support means something is bad, means something is wrong, right? What we want to do in a proactive program is utilize peer support for the good, the bad, and the in-between. Peer support is not just something to utilize when something is bad. It's meant to be in an effective, proactive approach. It's meant to be utilized and normalized for the good and the in-between as well. All right, who peer support is utilized for? In a reactive peer support program, peer support is only utilized for those in need, right? Only utilized for those in need. Now, we want peer support to be utilized for those in need, but we want peer support, as I was just saying, to be for the good, the bad, and the in-between. We want it to be utilized by everyone and for everyone. So in a proactive program, a proactive peer support program ensures all personnel receive regular check-ins, okay? Everyone is receiving regular check-ins. Everyone is part of the peer support program. And lastly, problem solving. In a reactive peer support program, generally speaking, a reactive peer support program kind of conceptualizes the program as something that attempts to solve problems only after they've begun, right? Again, we're talking about deploying after critical incidents. We're talking about someone reaching out, getting to the step and they reach out and start the conversation that something is wrong. Again, we want all that to still be in place, but we don't only want peer support to be something to be utilized after a problem has started. In a proactive program, we are preemptively identifying and solving potential problems before they even occur, before the problem even starts, or intervening early, right? And again, I'll go into in the next part talking about when we're talking about guidelines, but we want peer support to be utilized ahead of time as well, not just reactionary. So here's that nice little nifty model again. We see that proactive peer support covers all 3 lines of defense, okay? We have that first line of defense, which is prevention. Essentially, when we have a proactive peer support program, it is intended to keep healthy people healthy. That really is the goal. And unfortunately, and we all fall into this, both with mental health and physical health, when things are going well, we kind of start to slack on the things that we do that keep us feeling well, right? And so when we start to slack on those things, we start feeling less well, right? So what we want to, when we're just focusing on wellness in general, but when we're doing it through a peer support lens, we want peer support to be utilized for the good, the bad, the in-between, for all personnel receiving regular check-ins. We want to keep the healthy people healthy, not only to utilize it for people who are in need, but to also utilize it for people who are not in need. It also covers that second line of defense. It prevents issues from worsening, right? So if in a proactive program through the Peer Connect app, we get a notification on the peer support team to reach out to someone because it's next week is the 2nd year anniversary of when this individual's, child died, right? And we reach out and, that in and of itself intervenes maybe and was what that person needed to prevent, what they're experiencing to actually snowball and get worse. And lastly, of course, we want peer support to help those in dire need as well. We still want that crisis intervention component of peer support to be there, but we want all of these 3 things to be there: the first, the second, and the third lines of defense. All right, so now that we've identified what peer support is, we've identified the barriers, and we've identified how that proactive approach fills in those barriers, let's talk about general guidelines for proactive peer support. This is a 1-hour webinar, so this is just kind of a flash of what these guidelines might look like, but each of these would be, in an actual formalized training that I'd be giving for peer support programs and teams. Each of these would be addressed more specifically. First guideline, start early. In a proactive peer support program, we want to start early. We want to start with early on in someone's career, right? I've heard kind of the sentiment many times of like, they're probies. Why are they gonna need peer support? They haven't even seen anything yet. They've barely been on the job, right? That's not the mindset. We want to keep healthy people healthy. We want to intervene early. So we want to start as early as possible, including with new recruits. It's not just the seasoned first responder who's getting peer support and getting regular check-ins. We start and normalize peer support from the beginning. Guideline number 2, personnel of all rankings get check-ins, okay? Now, I am speaking primarily to leadership when I say this, but this includes leadership. I have worked with some agencies with really wonderful people in positions of leadership who are really wanting to do what they can to keep their personnel healthy. Then they're like, well, no, I'm not doing that. I'm the chief. I'm the assistant chief. Then that's not for me, right? We want everyone of all rankings to utilize this, not only because generally speaking, it's good for them, but it's also because of that modeling. I cannot tell you how important it is, the top-down effect of when leadership also models that it is normal and okay and encouraged to approach wellness, right? Through something like peer support. Okay, so I said I'd go into a little bit more about this. So remember, in a proactive peer support program, we're not utilizing peer support is not only incident specific and not only when someone reaches out because they're in need of help, right? We also want to utilize peer support preemptively to identify events or timeframes that pose risk. Now, when I say risk, I could be meaning actual events that could be, someone's struggling, it's causing them distress in some way, but they don't always need to be events or timeframes that are, generally speaking, bad, like bad things happen during this time frame. It could also be events or timeframes that basically are major life transitions, right? So for one, anniversary dates. This is one of the most obvious preemptive ways we can utilize peer support, right? It could be the anniversary date of a mass casualty. It could be the anniversary date of the suicide of a close friend or crew member. It could be the anniversary date of the death of a child. I also like to point out some anniversary dates that kind of fly under the radar sometimes are things like someone's been sober for the first time for 6 months and their birthday is coming up next week, right? And that would be an example of an anniversary date where, for individuals who are having to spend their first birthday sober, it could be a daunting thing. What do I do? In the past, I've just partied as hard as I possibly can, and now I'm sober, right? So that's another example of an anniversary date. Another example, birth of a child. Now you might be thinking, what are you talking about, Brooke? That's not a bad thing, right? Remember, we're not viewing this as only things that are inherently bad or inherently distressing of that kind. The birth of the child could be a very exciting, happy, hopefully time. However, it is a major life transition, whether it's your first child or your fifth child. It is a major life transition and something that we would want to utilize peer support for, to reach out, just say, just checking out. I heard, so exciting. Your wife's due date's coming up, right? How you doing? What's going on? How's the fam feeling about it? Retirement. This is a whole training, 8-hour training on its own. But utilizing peer support while someone's approaching retirement is extremely, extremely, extremely important. So preemptively identifying event and time frame, retirement would be one of those. Promotion. Here's another one. Maybe not inherently bad at all, right? Someone's hoping or expecting to get a promotion. Now, there's 2 scenarios that this turns out in that both I have seen. Okay, one of these, someone expects to get a promotion and they don't, and they crumble. It really affects them. They're not doing so well, right? And so we can see why peer support, preemptively reaching out and checking in afterwards would be important. However, say the person does get the promotion. Again, it's a transition. It's a new role, new leadership, new responsibilities, right? So that would be an example of something that isn't necessarily inherently bad, but that is still taking on new life transitions. Marriage is another one, hopefully a happy thing. However, major life transition. And lastly, another example would be the finalization of someone's divorce. So another guideline involving check-in and follow-up. I'm not going to go into details today about, exactly what that looks like, the details of how exactly and when exactly to check in, but I will put out 2 tidbits about check-in and follow-up. So if we're talking about, this proactive approach to peer support and preemptively reaching out to people, what we want to do is we want to use info gathered at each check-in to determine the need for additional check-ins. Okay. And what I mean by that is, again, this would be utilized, this would be, I instruct this in formalized training, but gaining clinical skills or skills to determine, okay, would it be useful for me to reach out? Does this person, could this person utilize me reaching, could it be useful for me to reach out again? So let me give you an example. I called John, John's divorce is finalized next week. So I give him a call and I'm like, hey, John, how you doing? Just wanted to check in. I know your divorce is being finalized soon. How you feeling? And John's like, oh, hey, man. Oh, man. Like, I cannot tell you how much of a weight has been lifted off my shoulders. Like I was in that marriage for far too long. It was not right for me. And I'm starting to feel like myself again. Awesome, right? That would be a scenario where, yeah, we probably don't need to check in again. John seems to actually be doing well. We don't need to check in again next week and say, John, okay, it's finalized. How are you doing now, right? Let me give you a similar scenario, same scenario. I called John. I'm like, John, how you doing? And he says, I don't know. I guess it needed to happen. And, I wasn't happy, but I don't know. I don't really know what to feel. Just feeling kind of lost, right? And that's the way the conversation goes. John could probably use a check-in, right? And so that would be clinical information to be like, I'm going to check in with John again next week. Now, if you do plan to check in with someone, be transparent about your plan to check in again. Tell them at the end of your conversation, hey, John, if it's okay with you, I'm going to call you again next week. Just want to check in with you. I hope to catch you, right? If you tell someone that you're going to check in and if you're going to follow up, please follow up, right? So if I tell John I'm going to call again next week and I don't call, that's a no-no for many reasons. It someone who was expecting and hoping for the support might not get that support. They can go into further isolation. It could build rapport and trust with peer support in general, right? So it's very important to actually follow up if you said you would. Okay, another guideline, very important, avoiding leading and presumptuous language. Here's what I mean by that. We're talking about this proactive, comprehensive approach where we're not only using peer support, we're deploying it after critical incidents. People are reaching out. They're more comfortable with it, so they're more comfortable reaching out to peer support, but that we are also as peer supporters reaching out. What we don't want to do is start these calls assuming that they're not doing well or assuming that this is really difficult for them, right? So, hey, John, I know your divorce is coming up and I know you're going to be going through a lot of tough emotions next week. I know I did when I was divorced, right? Or I know this is a tough time for you, so I wanted to check in, right? We don't want to lead or presume that someone's actually struggling, right? What we want to do is be transparent about why we're calling. We don't want to beat around the bush, but not presumptuous. Like my example, hey, John, I know you're going through a divorce. Just wanted to call in, check in. How are you doing? Right? We want to lead with open-ended questions. We want to be transparent, but not presumptuous. Keep things informal. So I talked about how the research has shown that first responders prefer informal interactions, which is one reason why peer support can be very effective. So along these lines, when you're a peer supporter and you're a peer support member, a structured agenda when reaching out to people is not necessary. You don't need to have, okay, I need to hit these points. I need to make sure I cover this. Along those lines as well, check-ins can be brief. Right? When we're thinking about proactive peer support, remember, we're reaching out for the good, the bad, the in-between, right? So it's not necessarily that someone's always going to need to talk to someone, but we want everyone to get regular check-ins. We want to normalize, build the relationships between peer supporters and other personnel and normalize that someone's just calling me to check in, right? Yeah, no, I'm good, man. Thanks for checking in. Anyways, I got to go, right? Check-ins can be brief. We don't need to add any pressure to it. Another guideline is to consider coactive peer support. So we talked about what coactive peer support is, departments that maybe don't have a large enough staff base, maybe they're in a rural area, or maybe just generally speaking, personnel don't feel comfortable talking. There's a lot of personnel who wouldn't feel comfortable talking to the available peer support members. What coactive peer support does and what the Peer Connect app allows as well is to build the peer support member base by joining forces with outside agencies as well. So we have more peer support members and more individuals that someone would be more likely to reach out to because it's not necessarily at their own agency or department. So it provides the distance that some people need to feel safe when utilizing peer support, which of course then increases utilization. All right, last guideline I want to cover. Remember, the bad, the in-between, and the good. That's what we want to utilize proactive peer support for. So we want to utilize it for positive events and timeframes as well. We don't want peer support to just be associated with the bad, right? With issues, with something bad is happening. We want it to also be normalized and utilized with check-ins for all personnel, for good things, for accomplishments, for milestones, for recognition. Hey, I heard that, hey, just wanted to call. I heard your 2-year sober date came out. That's pretty awesome. Just want to say congrats, man. That's so cool to hear. I heard what you did on that call the other day. That's awesome. Great job, right? We want to utilize it for positive events and timeframes as well. All right, our last part here. Now that we've identified the barriers, talked about proactive frameworks, talked about guidelines, let's talk about what the key takeaways are from all of this. Takeaway number 1. An effective peer support program is integral to wellness programming. It is a necessity. It is a must. It's not should we have this as part of our peer support or as part of our wellness program. It is a must, right? We've talked about why that peer support programming, having an effective peer support program improves mental health, improves the well-being, both physically and mentally of personnel. It's often the first line of intervention for personnel. It is very, very, very important. Second takeaway, when utilized both proactively and reactively, peer support is beneficial to all personnel throughout all stages of their career, for all rankings, right? We're starting early. We're utilizing it for all personnel. Everyone's receiving regular check-ins for the good, the bad, and the in-between. It's beneficial for everyone. Takeaway number 3, and I already mentioned this, in many cases, peer support is the first line of intervention for first responders. First responders are more likely to reach out to a peer first when they're having a problem or talk to a peer about a problem that they're having, as opposed to just on their own, okay, I'm having this issue, I'm going to reach out to a therapist in the community. Not to say that that doesn't happen, but it's much less likely. So when we're talking about that proactive framework to wellness programming, the first and second lines of defense, peer support is more likely to tackle those first and second lines of defense. Takeaway number 4, building an effective peer support program is a short-term investment with long-term benefits. And this kind of ties back to what I was saying when we're talking about the individual and organizational impacts, right? And I really like to stress this, with funding and all of that, is that yes, it will take time and thought and money in the short term to build an effective peer support program. But then that same amount of time and thought and money is not consistently going into it. It's just there for the start. And then if you put the right amount of time and all that effort and funding into it, then it lasts and is able to function like a well-oiled machine on its own, right? So it's a short-term investment with very long-term benefits, including overall lower cost for the agency. Agencies in any location and at any size can create and benefit from peer support. I've talked to many agencies that are like, we're so small or we're in a rural part and I just don't see how it's possible. Well, it is possible. We've talked about coactive peer support, particularly with an app like Peer Connect. Coactive peer support can really tackle that barrier. So agencies in any location and of any size can create and benefit from peer support. Lastly, number 6, you do not need to know how to build and implement an effective peer support program on your own. It can be really daunting. Where do we start? What do we do? This is a little bit of a plug for myself, but there are other people like me, but bringing on people who are culturally competent, who have the training, who have the specialization in doing these things to put in that short-term investment so that they are no longer needed. You're not going to need them or someone like me for an extended period of time just to help get it up and running, and then it operates on its own. So with that said, here's my information, my number, my email, my website. This QR code goes directly to my website. Please, I'm really looking forward to the discussion and Q&A here, but please, please, please always feel free to reach out. My line is always open. So yeah, thanks everyone for listening and happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Brooke. That was well received and well appreciated. We do have some questions. If you're comfortable answering them right on the spot, then I will fire a few of them at you. So sure. We had one person ask, they said, I am one of 5 peer support members at my police department. We're transitioning into the proactive aspect, but we're having some issues with policy and how we're going to be able to effectively do this. Do you have any suggestions how to make more of a smooth transition?
I guess I don't know who asked this, but I would want to kind of answer that question initially with a question in terms of when we're talking about policy. I don't know if this person is talking about like they're not necessarily getting the funding to do it, or they're not necessarily getting the support from top down. I don't know if that person's comfortable answering that.
If whoever wrote that wants to unmute and expand on it, feel free. If you're able. Oh, okay.
There's
So
conversation in the chat there, Nick, if you see it.
Oh, I think I can open the chat. Oh, they don't have a policy yet. Okay, no worries, no worries. Okay, so the issue is that there is actually no written policy in place right now. I think that's what you're saying. Okay, yeah. So this is when it is helpful to speak with leadership, management, etc. About any agency specific necessities and needs, but also to think as a peer support program, what are ways to what are things that are important to us, right? So thinking about how do we protect ourselves, right? As peer support members, what are things, these are just kind of like prompts to start then funneling down, okay, what would this actually look like in a policy? So what is the bigger picture? Well, we want to make sure we're following the rules of the agency, right? We don't want to cross any boundaries or step over any lines in general of like what the actual rules and policies are of the agency as a whole. We want to make sure that we are protected as well. We want to make sure that the people who are utilizing peer support are aware of what peer support is, and in situations in which we would actually have to break confidentiality, right? So that's confidentiality is like important one. So what are the bigger pictures, kind of stepping outside of the box with your peer support team and help having and starting to kind of jot down these bigger picture things, and then slowly starting to chip away at what that actually looks like in practice, right? It could also be helpful to bring in a consultant to help you identify those areas that are specific to your agency.
thank you. Yeah, actually, and along that line, I think something that we hear a lot from our clients or people interested in Peer Connect is, and something that you've shifted is, it doesn't always have to be negative. So these proactive check-ins can be on the positive side, which then doesn't necessitate that someone would be upset of receiving them. So that was something I learned, putting some emphasis on the proactive being positive and attached to anniversaries, promotions, different things like that. So that was good. Now, another question. In regard to the data supporting benefits of peer support, do you have any references you can share with us?
Yeah, I can. How about if you can, Kate, if you can make a note of that, and I can send you those peer support or those peer reviewed articles. And then if you guys at Peer Connect can send that out to them.
Definitely, yeah. And we do hear a lot of people that are in the startup phase of a peer support team. They know that they have to become salespeople to their admin staff. So that always helps push it closer towards the budget, the almighty budget. Great. We will, as I mentioned, be sending out follow-up information that I believe will include a survey. So you can give us some feedback. This is the first kind of webinar we've done, and we were very lucky and thankful to have Brooke do this for us. So your feedback would be great if you attended and can look for that survey in the next few days and reply to that. That would help us plan if we're going to keep doing these, what kind of topics you're interested in, any questions about Dr. Bartlett's services, our services. I know we have a mix of existing Peer Connect clients and just interested folks, and even some trainers, and a few people even from treatment centers I know are in here. So thanks everyone for doing that. We can open the floor if anyone has any last minute questions. They just want to, you can use the raise hand thing, or you can just shout them out before we get going. All right, and you know where to find us. So Dr. Bartlett's information's on the screen there. We'll also send that out in the follow-up email. And any other questions you have in the meantime, send it our way and we'll get that out to you. But once again, thank you, Brooke, for sharing with us. And thank you everyone for attending. It was great to have so many people take this time out of your day. And we will keep you updated as we move along.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate you being here and listening.
Great. Okay. Have a good day and afternoon, everyone.